Hi, welcome to Non-Inkables. I wanted to go over some general TCG terms that you may hear people use that I definitely didn't know what they meant, and so I wanted to share. So let's get started. First word that you'll hear a ton of is meta. So that refers to the most popular decks that are currently showing up in large numbers in a tournament, or in the case of Pixelborn, that people tend to be playing. So in-person tournaments, it's kind of limited by what cards people have. So some decks people want to play. So for example, if you wanted to play a Ruby deck that had Maleficent Dragon, that card is very expensive, and so it might not be seen as much. In Pixelborn, because you can play any card you want, it's unlimited, limited only by imagination. And so meta refers basically to the proportion of which type of deck is showing up. So they can say like, oh, in set 2, the meta was all Ruby Amethyst, meaning everyone was playing a Ruby Amethyst deck. And now in set 3, the meta is very diverse, so you will see a lot of different types of decks. Another word that you may hear is mulligan. So that refers to that first part where you get your 7 cards, and then you, in the very beginning of the game, and you decide if you want to keep or if you want to trade 0 to 7 of those 7 cards, and that is called the mulligan. You may also hear people say, oh, this card is OP, which means overpowered. So it means they think that this card is super, super strong and maybe like way stronger than all the other cards and makes the other cards' effects almost meaningless. Another word you may hear is drop. So they'll say, oh, this is a 1-drop character. This is a 2-drop character. And that refers to how much ink it costs to play that character. So I think of it as like 1 drop in the inkwell, 1 drop of ink. Something you'll hear a lot is tap. So they say like, oh, I'll tap this character, or I'll tap my ink for 2 or something like that. And that just means exert. And I think that is a term that carried over from Magic, because in Magic you tap the cards and in Lorcana you exert the cards, but it means the same thing. Another word you may hear is called brick. So that refers to when your hand has all uninkable cards and you can't play any of them, and so you're bricking, like you're stalled out there. You can't ink any cards and you can't play any cards because the ink you have is not enough to play the cards in your hand, but you can't ink any of the cards in your hand, so you can't even increase your ink. It's a horrible position to be in. I'm in it for some reason all the time. Another word you will hear is called scry. I think you tend to hear this a lot in people who play Sapphire decks, because they have cards like Develop Your Brain, and there's a Grammatala where it lets you look at the top whatever number of cards and you can choose one and put one in the bottom, things like that. So that refers to like looking through your deck to basically get rid of the cards you don't want to draw. Another word that is used a lot, and from what I've looked up and also when talking to Brian, it seems like it's a little controversial what it means, and that word is tempo. So some people will say that it's the pace at which you play threats, and basically you want to be as efficient and as impactful each turn when you play. And so if you were to ruin someone's tempo, it means like they have a very set, like, I want to play this card on turn 1, this card on turn 2, this card on turn 3. So for example, in Emerald Steel, they say I want to play Curse Merfolk turn 1, Flynn Rider turn 2, Ursula Deceiver of All turn 3. Let's say you play like a Cloud Kicker and it bounces that Ursula back to their hand. You've messed up their tempo because they were going to sing on turn 4, but because you bounced that Ursula back, they have to replay it or go for a totally different strategy. And so that is like when you mess up someone's tempo. Essentially, the goal is that you want to be as efficient as possible and you want to make your opponent inefficient. And so like by bouncing back that Ursula, you have messed up their tempo by making their turn 3 basically useless, because you've negated everything they've done on turn 3, or not everything, but one of the things they try to do on turn 3. And so you are countering them and making them inefficient and messing up their tempo. Next, we'll talk about the different types of decks. This, I looked up a lot of things. There is a Magic person, I think he's called the Professor, and I watched his video on this, and a lot of the same terms they use in Lorcana, because I think a lot of the really good players come from Magic, and so those are the words they use. And so some of them initially didn't make sense to me, but after watching the Magic version, I'm like, oh, okay, I get it. So first type of deck that people will talk about is an aggressive deck or a hyper aggressive deck or aggro, hyper aggro. So to me in my head, I was like, oh, aggressive, does that mean like just killing a lot of things? And I guess in Magic it does. Your goal is to do a lot of damage. However, in Lorcana, because we are Disney and we do not kill our characters, they only get banished, and our goal is to get lore, it means aggressively getting lore. So usually in a aggressive or hyper aggressive aggro deck, you will see the opponent plays like a lot of cards that are very cheap in terms of how much ink they cost, but they quest for a lot of lore. So in Emerald, like if you play Curse Merfolk, Flynn Rider, those count as like an aggressive strategy. Essentially, your characters don't cost very much, but they quest for 2 lore, so that's very aggressive. You will also see people play like the Pinocchio Star Attraction that quests for 3, or the Maleficent that quests for 2, and those only cost 1 or 2 ink. And so their goal is they can play each turn a bunch of tiny little characters that quest for a lot of lore. And so before you can do anything to build up your board, they've already gotten to 20 and they win. A lot of times those decks will win by like turn 5. So before you have time to do anything, they've already won. So that is one strategy. Those characters are usually very weak, so they're very easy to kill, or to banish, sorry for Disney. They're very easy to banish, but you have to have enough characters to banish it. Because even if you have very strong characters, if you only have 2 of them and they have like 7 characters, there's nothing you can do. Another type of deck is called control. So that deck tries to basically outlast the opponent's assault, and then they win by having stronger cards. So it doesn't really have a lot of small characters. It has a lot of big characters. And then the small characters they have tend to be very defensive and reactive. So an example of a card in a control deck would be like Queen of Hearts, the 2-cost Queen of Hearts that rushes. And so it's not a super strong character, but if you see a threat on your opponent's board you want to get rid of, you play that and you can attack it immediately. And then basically when you're playing against those control decks, what they will try to do is anything you play, they will try to get rid of. And then by the end, if your characters, if you're playing a more aggressive deck or less of a control deck, your characters are not very strong. So by the end, their characters will just be stronger than yours and they'll just win because of that. So that is one type of deck. Another type of deck is called combo, and it's essentially like a synergy deck. So you're trying to combo cards together to have a bigger effect. An example of that would be like if you play Belle, Strange but Special, and she gets 4 lore if you have 10 ink or more. And then you combo that with a lucky dime. So you can use the lucky dime to get those 4 lore without her even questing. So that would be like a combo move. Or like a lucky dime and Tomato is a combo move. And so combo decks just refer to decks that are focused on that synergy between the different cards. Another type of deck is called mid-range. And this type of deck can be both aggressive and can be control. So it's a little bit slower than aggressive, so it doesn't have as many little characters that quest for a ton, but it does have some. And then it can also play as a control deck with stronger characters. So it's kind of like has the flexibility of both an aggro deck and a control deck. It's like a combo of the both. And then it depends who the opponent is. If the opponent is control, they will try to play aggro and win fast before those big control characters can get out. Or if it's playing against an aggro deck, it will try to control those aggro characters and kill them all. So another type of deck is called a tempo deck. And this one I was kind of confused in terms of what it means as a deck versus what it means as a general phrase. And in terms of a tempo deck, timing is everything, obviously, because it's tempo. And usually it's pretty hard to play. And it's very much like calculating what you have versus what your opponent has and figuring out what the best move at each turn is, essentially. And then, which is kind of true for every deck. But it focuses on that. Another kind of deck you'll hear is called a mill deck or a wheel deck. And this comes from Magic. There is a card called Wheel of Fortune, and it does essentially the same thing as a Whole New World in Lorcana. So discards all their cards, replaces all their cards. In Lorcana, replaces it with 7 cards. And the goal of this deck is not to get to 20 lore. It is to make your opponent discard and draw cards until they run out of cards, and they have to run out faster than you, and you win by default. So I think a lot of decks have built-in drawing ability. So for example, in Sapphire, you have Hiram Flaversham. He draws you cards. In Amethyst, you have Friends on the Other Side to draw you cards. And so a lot of decks are worried about not having enough cards. And then this mill/wheel deck basically utilizes that fact that most people will try to get more cards, and then you just keep taking out their cards and making them draw more. And so sometimes without you realizing it, you've run out of cards. It happened to me once, and now I'm always like, are they trying, every time they play Whole New World, I go, are they trying to mill me? And it hasn't happened again. It's only literally happened once, but just something to be on the lookout for, because there is a second way to win Lorcana. You will also hear about budget decks, and this just is what you think it means. It's a cheaper deck. So certain cards in Lorcana are very expensive, and so it makes the deck expensive if you're going to play 4 copies. So for example, cards in this category would be like Beast, Tragic Hero, Robin Hood, Champion of Sherwood, Ursula, Deceiver of All, Maleficent, Dragon. Those cards cost $30, $40, $60. And so if you want to play 4 of them in your deck, you could be like $200, $300 just for that one, just 4 cards, and you need a 60 card deck. And so budget decks refer to cards that are cheaper. Zach Bevins has a lot of budget decks. And then Zan Syed also sometimes has budget decks where they're more like $60 for all the cards in the deck. And those are the major types of decks that exist currently in Lorcana. I'm sure with the new set and the new mechanics, new things will happen, and I'm very excited for that. And then let's talk about some common Lorcana deck types. So common ink combinations, essentially. One you will hear is Amber and Steel together. Sometimes it'll be called Steel Song because it relies on the Amber characters that are singers. So like Ariel, Cinderella, mostly those two. They can sing songs that are more expensive than what they personally cost as characters to play. So Cinderella, she costs 1 ink, but she can play 3 ink songs. Ariel costs 3 ink, but she can sing 5 ink songs. And so also because singing songs is free, essentially, those decks utilize that to win. So it's basically creating more efficiency in terms of you don't have to pay ink to play these songs to get their effects, you can just sing them. And there are different variations of these decks. So there are variations that include flutes. So Sleepy's Flute as a card. Every time you play a song, you can get 1 lore. Some of them include Lanterns. So that is a card that lets you pay 1 ink less for the next character. Some of them include Pride Lands. So Pride Lands is a location card, and that card came up because a lot of people were running an item removal card, so usually Benja. So when you play him, it removes the item, and so it was getting rid of people's flutes and lanterns. So they weren't getting very good use of that. Whereas Pride Lands is a location, so more difficult to remove. So that's one type of Amber deck. Another type of Amber deck is Amber Ruby. And those are usually decks with Mufasa. So they're called Mufasa decks. Or if you watch Spessy, he calls them Bufasa decks. And essentially it relies on the character Mufasa. So he is a 3 strength, 3 willpower, quest for 2 character, but he has the ability that when you banish him, you can take the top card in your deck and flip it over. If it is a character, you can play that character for free. So if you end up flipping over, say, like a Chernobog, who is super strong and quest for 3, that would be a good deal. Sometimes you flip over like an Olaf or, something. Minnie Mouse, always classy. It's a 1 ink character, not as great. But because of that effect of Mufasa, those decks tend to just have characters so that you're more likely when you flip over that top card in your deck to get a character. Other types of cards, so Emerald Steel is a type of deck. That's the one I played for set championships. So it's usually a discard deck. So the goal of that deck is to make your opponent have no cards in their hands. So you're getting rid of their resources. And then if they're just drawing the top card off of the top of their deck, they are left with the hard decision of, do I want to play this card or do I want to put this in my inkwell so that later I can play a better card? Emerald Steel decks turn to either be Bucky based, so they have Bucky in them, and Bucky's ability is every time you play a Floodborn character, your opponent discards a card. Sometimes they also have Prince John, so that's another type. And Prince John is when your opponent discards a card, you get to draw a card. So it's basically giving a 2-card advantage because your opponent is losing 1 and you're gaining 1. Some decks have tried to combine both Bucky and Prince John together, although it's hard to draw that. And sometimes in an Emerald Steel deck, you'll also see Tiana kind of towards the top. And Tiana is a character where when you have no cards in your hand, your opponent can't sing songs, which is very effective against the Amber Steel song decks. There are two ramp decks, essentially, that are very popular. One is Ruby Sapphire and one is Sapphire Steel. So Sapphire is the ramp portion. And that refers to the fact that Sapphire has a lot of cards that say, like, if you play this card, you can put another card in your inkwell. Or like Fishbone Quill. Every time you can exert Fishbone Quill to ink something, like an extra card. So instead of inking once per turn, you can ink multiple times per turn. There's also cards like Grammatala, where if she gets banished, she just goes into your inkwell instead of discard. So then you end up having way more ink than your opponent, ideally. And so then you can play these big old characters or like be prepared way earlier than your opponent can. And then there's a Ruby version that has, it's basically like that ramp part with the attack cards of Ruby. So like Lady Tremaine, Madame Medusa, Maui, Be Prepared, that kind of stuff. And then there's also a Steel version. So you have that Sapphire ramp with Steel songs and like Giant Tink, that kind of thing. Both tend to also use Belle and Tamatoa. So Belle, she has one ability where you get to ink an extra card every turn. That I don't see used as often, but she also has the ability where if you have more than 10 ink in your inkwell, she quests for 4 instead of for 1. And then Tamatoa, he has however many lore based on how many items you have in play, and Sapphire has a lot of items. And so Tamatoa usually can quest for like 3 or 4. And then since set 3 came out and Lucky Dime came out, Lucky Dime lets you get the lore of a character, however much lore they should be getting. So it lets you basically get that amount of lore. So say Belle has 4 lore because you have more than 10 ink. Lucky Dime lets you get that when Belle is still wet and can't actually quest yet. And so it doesn't matter as much if she dies the next turn before she even quests, because you already got utility out of her 4 lore from your Lucky Dime. Sometimes you'll hear it called a popsicle deck, just because normally in these ramp decks, first turn they play popsicle, and that card lets you draw another card. So now I've been seeing a lot of either popsicle or develop your brain on turn 1. Sometimes those Sapphire Steel decks are also called Zoolander because of blue steel, you know, that face he makes. That was not the face, but you get it. Other decks you may see that are more popular now. So I've been seeing a lot of Emerald Amethyst decks, and those tend to have, those are usually hyper aggressive, so hyper aggro. So they have that like turn 1 Merfolk quest for 2, turn 2 Flynn Rider quest for 2. But then they also have all those bounce characters from Amethyst. So they'll play their Merfolk, next turn they'll quest their Merfolk, they'll bounce their Merfolk, and so that you can't even attack it if you wanted to. And then some of their cards, if you do attack it, you have to discard a card. So it's kind of like a comboing of that bounce and the discard. I realized I didn't talk about bounce. So bounce is when happens in Amethyst. It's when you play a card, and to play that card you have to put another card that's already out back into your hand. So you're bouncing it back to your hand. So for example, you play Madame Mim Snake, and you have to bounce a card back into your hand, otherwise she just dies and you can't do anything. And so that is what they call bounce. And it's really useful for if you have a card that, say, like when you play this card you get an effect, and then when it leaves play you get an effect. So like for example, Merlin Rabbit, when you play it you get a card, when it leaves play you get a card. Or Merlin Goat, when you play it you get lore, and then when it goes out of play you get lore. So you can play Merlin Goat, get 1 lore, play your Madame Mim Snake, bounce that goat back into your hand, and then you get another lore. So you've gotten 2 lore, your goat is not out there for them to attack, and you know, sometimes that wins you the game. Another type of deck I've seen a lot is Amber Amethyst. That also tends to be a hyper aggro deck, and it tends to have either Pluto, the 1-cost Pluto, where if you exert him you can pay 1 less for the next character, or it has Doc, which is a Snow White character, and when he quests you can pay 1 less for the next character. Sometimes you'll also see Amethyst Sapphire decks, and those are usually called Blurple. And so it uses like the ramp of Sapphire combined with the bounce of Amethyst. Amethyst Steel has been getting more popular recently, and usually that deck plays Blue Fairy. So she is an evasive card, I think 2 cost, and every time you play a Floodborn character you get to draw a card. And then another type of deck, last type I'm going to talk about, is Ruby Steel. So that is usually a pirate deck, and I have tried to make that work, but so far no luck. But hopefully with set 4 and the new cards it'll work. So those are the major types of decks that you will see in Lorcana as of now. Who knows what will happen in set 4, and some terms that I didn't know, and I'm still learning, and hopefully one day I will understand truly what tempo means, because I feel like every time I ask somebody, they say something different, and it's very confusing. But those are the major words. Hopefully that was helpful for you guys, because definitely would have helped me, because I watch these creators who are so good at playing Lorcana, and they play like a bunch of other games, and they're so good, and they try to explain stuff, and I don't know what the words mean, and I'm just like, I know what you're saying is very important and would be very helpful, but it's like you're speaking another language. And so I am keeping a list of the words I learned, and as I learn more, I will post more and share with you guys what I've learned. All right, and as always, keep shuffling. Hopefully you don't end up with a whole hand of non-inkables like me, because that always happens to me. Most people call them uninkables, but I figure for a channel name, non-inkables was better. And check out our TCG store. It is live. We're updating it all the time. And good luck. Bye.